Let me take this occasion to welcome each one of you. It's always nice to see you enjoying your interactions with each other. And always I try to acknowledge that we have visitors with us. And if you are not a member of St. Luke's but are here tonight, we're so pleased that you can be a part of our circle of love here. I think this is one of the easiest places to enter the life of St. Luke's, and we do want to embody God's hospitality. Anna, in New Orleans last weekend, her mother had her 80th birthday, and we had the great joy of convening about 40 family members to celebrate that milestone. We flew down on Southwest, and on both legs, the pilot would come on at some juncture and say what I've heard many times, namely, I know you had a choice, and therefore thank you for choosing Southwest. As I say, I've heard that a lot of times, and I always like it, because it suggests to me that here is an industry that doesn't take for granted what people are doing, that acknowledges people have freedom, and therefore exercises gratitude. Well, tonight I want to turn this around and say to you that I know you had a choice as to what to do tonight. And Wednesday's at the middle of the week. I know all of you have heavy plates, lots of different things you could have done. There are lots of new restaurants opening here in Birmingham. You know, Jimmy's, Azalea, a lot of places you could have chosen to eat tonight. So I want to thank you knowing that you had a choice, that you've chosen to be with us, and to say that special word of welcome. I also want to thank you for the wonderful attention that across the years you've given in these teachings. At our staff meeting the other morning, some of us clergy were reporting about what it's like to do the Eucharist service out at St. Martin's. This is our wonderful retirement home. And every Thursday they have a communion service, and different clergy participate. And my father was out there for the last 4 years of his life, so it's a very dear place for me. But it's not the easiest place in the world to preach, I'll be honest with you, because a lot of people are there with limited abilities to hear and to stay awake and things like that. One time I was out there preaching away, and this is when my father was alive, and this lady about midway back in a loud voice said, "Who is that?" And my father in an equally loud voice said, "That's my boy." And here they were, going back and forth with each other, with me up there trying to preach. But the other day, Joy Fitz was telling us that Marianne Aiken was out preaching at one of those services, and a resident of the nursing home had been wheeled into the chapel for the service, and somehow she still had her remote control television instrument in her hands. And Marianne says all through the sermon she was trying to change the channel, and that's a real referendum on what you're doing. You know, when somebody is doing that. Well, I want to thank you for not bringing your remote controls with you tonight. And if you have, don't let me see them if you're trying to change. But in all seriousness, I know you had a choice, and I do thank you that you've chosen to come. Before we have our prayer, I have two quick announcements I want to make. First, a sad announcement. Jack Sullivan, who for many years was the treasurer of our church, died last night and is going to be buried in the morning at a graveside service at Elmwood. Jack was been a wonderful, long-time member of this parish. He was actually on the search committee that called Ann and me. He used to come to the early service. I would have coffee up in what was in the founder's room, and he always referred to me as John, my boy. I always knew it was Jack. He was a wonderful contributor to the life of this church. And he and his wife had been married 59 years. She was a devout Roman Catholic, and they were able to have a very wonderful marriage, though in different churches. But he's going to be buried in the morning at 10 o'clock at Elmwood. The other is a happy announcement. This Saturday at 10:30, the Diocese of Alabama is going to consecrate our newly elected Bishop Coadjutor, Henry Parsley, coming here from Charlotte, North Carolina. If you've never been to a service of consecration, it's really a very wonderful, wonderful Anglican pageant. This is going to be in the Battle Coliseum at Birmingham Southern. Chris White, our youth minister, has offered to drive our church van, and he already has almost all the seats taken. So if you would like to go to the consecration Saturday morning, we're going to meet here about 9:15, and if you want to come here, even if the van is full, there'll be some other cars, because there is going to be somewhat limited parking at Birmingham Southern. But I would commend that service to you if you would like to do that. I think you would find it a very moving experience. And let me just say personally, I could not be more delighted at the selection of Bishop Parsley. He is going to be a godly presence in our community. He was born without knees. It's a congenital situation that I frankly had never heard about. His son has the same problem, which is to say he is no stranger to physical handicap, and he has used that to deepen his spirit. I think you're going to find him a very insightful leader, a very compassionate pastor. I think we are most blessed as a diocese that he was chosen, and that he is beginning Saturday to be a bishop coadjutor, which means he will serve along with Bishop Miller, but he has the right of succession. Some of you have heard me say that. You knew a wonderful old Roman Catholic bishop in Fort Worth who had a suffragan bishop, which is just a bishop who serves at the pleasure of the bishop, and then a bishop coadjutor who had the right of succession. And this old bishop used to say to me, I can always tell which is which on Monday morning, because the suffragan comes in and says, Bishop, what do you want me to do? And the coadjutor comes in and says, Bishop, how are you feeling? We're just kind of moving him along. But Henry does have the right of succession when Bishop Miller feels called to retire. Again, welcome tonight to each of you. I know you had a choice. Thank you for choosing to be with us. Let's pray together. Dear God, we love you because you have first loved us. We open our hearts to you in hope because you have first opened your heart to us in love. It is awesome to know that you understand each one of us here tonight, the burdens we bring, the dilemmas we face, all the things that make up our unique lives, and that your grace is sufficient, whatever it is that we find ourselves up against. We are astonished that you, who know us best, also love us most. Therefore, come to us as a cleansing breeze. Fill our hearts with hope. Open us to the great future that is your gift to give. Take away our fear. And may we find ourselves not only in a company of loving family, but also in your glorious presence. Into that grace we now give ourselves through Christ our Lord. Amen. I have chosen for this fall to have us focus on a short and very personal letter that St. Paul wrote to the church at Philippi. It is a interesting, in many ways paradoxical little book, only 4 chapters long. I believe you could read it easily in 15 minutes anytime. A book that contains many beloved passages. I said last week that 70% of this content is used in our 3-year cycle on Sundays in the lectionary. It's a book that has much to give, and it is paradoxical in that it is written from prison. It was written while Paul was really up against very difficult circumstances. And yet 16 times in the 4 chapters you find the reality of joy identified. It is a beautiful testimony to the fact that we can live life from the inside out rather than the outside in. That our outward circumstances do not have to set the climate of our souls. And the fact that the prisoner facing the crisis of his life could so often identify that he was joyful and invite other people to be joyful is a very wonderful encouragement. And so tonight I want us to look at the first chapter. I spent most of the session last week giving you an introduction. I'm not going to repeat that, but just let me quickly sketch in the relationship between Paul and the Philippian church to give you some idea of the context out of which this letter is written. Paul's first contact with these persons who became the church eventually was in about 52 A.D. This is on his second missionary journey. He had every intention on that second missionary journey of going east into what is now Turkey, toward Constantinople. But in the city of Troas, he was open to God's leadership. He had a dream one night that a Macedonian, that is a Greek person, appeared to him and said, "Come over and help us." Now, Paul, like Jesus, I think, felt that the doors of God's providence open and that we need to answer readiness rather than press reluctance. He went where those that he could serve seemed to most want him. And so, in response to this Macedonian call, as it is known, he changed his plans from going east and crossed the Aegean Sea and made the first contact of the Christian faith with Europe. In fact, the church in Philippi is the first church to be established on European soil. And those of you who know the history of Western civilization know that was a tremendously significant moment because Christianity has become one of the formative factors in the whole shaping of Western culture in these last 20 centuries. And it all started when he crossed over and went west instead of east, and began to establish a Christian presence in what is now Europe. The little town of Philippi was very famous. It was not huge, but it was named for Philip, who was the father of Alexander the Great. It was the site of a very significant battle when Octavius won out over the assassins of Julius Caesar, and actually the Roman Empire was established after that battle. Octavius became known as Caesar Augustus, which meant the August Caesar. And so Philippi was close to where that battle was fought, and therefore it was a very, very significant city in terms of being a Roman outpost. And when Paul went to Philippi, there were so few Jewish people there that there was no synagogue, but he heard that there were a group of Jewish women that gathered out by the river to pray on Sabbath afternoon. And so he went out there on a Saturday afternoon and shared with them this thing which I spoke of last week that was absolutely life-changing. That is, he had discovered in Jesus Christ that the countenance of God was something very different than he had been taught to believe as a first century Jew. To the mystery of godness, Jesus gave a face, and on that face was not a scowl, as he had always thought, and that the law was a way of climbing into God's favor, but rather on that face was a smile. God's love originated in what God was and not in what we humans have to do. And so he never got over being astonished at how differently the face of God looked because of Jesus. And so for the rest of his life, he never tired of telling people that there was nothing that they could do to make God love them any more than God already loved them. There was nothing they could do to make God stop loving them, because love was the divine nature, not something that has to be earned, but a gift that can be graciously received. Well, he tells this wonderful news to this little group of Jewish women out by the riverbank. And a very highly prosperous Jewish woman named Lydia really did have happen to her what had happened to Paul. That is, she saw the face of God in a new way. She was the first convert. She was a very wealthy woman, had a big house, and she invited Paul and Silas and Timothy, the three that were together, to come and stay in her home, and from that base began to tell this good news to others. And so it was that was the first contact. There were 3 converts that we know about in the book of Acts in this emerging little church. After Lydia, who was a dealer in purple, had been converted, there was a slave girl who had psychic powers. You know, people have artistic powers, have musical gifts. Some people are the kinds of temperaments where the veil between the worlds is simply very thin. That is, they have psychic and incredibly intuitive powers. Here was a child in slavery who was so psychic that she could read fortunes, and some people that owned her were making a good profit out of getting her to read fortunes and charging a lot. Well, her spiritual sensitivity was such that she recognized in Paul that he was a messenger of God, and she began to say this widely. And once again, answering readiness rather than pressing reluctance, Paul spoke to this psychic little slave and opened her eyes to what a difference the face of God takes if you look at it through the lens of Jesus. And so she was converted, which meant she didn't want to go on being a fortune teller, didn't want to go on using these psychic gifts for selfish purposes. Well, naturally, the people that owned her and were making a profit out of her were very upset because Paul had disrupted their enterprise. Now, the cynical restatement of the golden rule is that those that have the gold rule. If you interrupt profits, you oftentimes encourage all kinds of hostility. Just a few days ago, a black Baptist minister friend of mine, associate pastor at Sardis Baptist Church, was killed in his own driveway. You probably read about it in the paper because he was protesting the sale of drugs in the black community, and he was getting in the way of profit, and he had to give his life for that. I've talked to Sam Pettigrew twice, the pastor at Sardis Baptist Church, about what somebody like I can do to reinforce the efforts that are being made not to let the drug culture just completely decimate that part of our city. But the point is, when you interrupt profit, you evoke all kinds of opposition. And so the owners of this psychic slave girl were so upset by what Paul had done for the girl that they went to the Roman authorities and accused Paul of being a disturber of the peace. They said he's preaching a religion that is getting everybody stirred up. Now, you all heard the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome that was so important. The Romans were really pretty reasonable rulers of the countries that they conquered, but what they could not tolerate was any social disturbance. Anybody that looked like he might cause a revolution, that they moved on very quickly. And the charge that was made against Paul and Silas and Timothy was that they were disturbing the peace. And so they were arrested and they were placed in jail. This was the first arrest of many that would come afterwards, all on this same charge of being a disturber of the peace. Now, later on, Christianity was outlawed, so to be a Christian was illegal. But at this stage, the charge against Paul was simply that he was disturbing the Roman peace, and they didn't like that. So he's put in jail, and to the jailer's great surprise, instead of being angry and vicious as most people who apprehended Paul and Silas, took it very lovingly. In the night, they were heard to be singing hymns, most unusual for jail behavior. And in the midst of the night, there was an earthquake, and all the walls of the jail were broken open. It was easy for all the other prisoners to escape into the night. And the Philippian jailer is devastated because suddenly what he's been given the responsibility of doing, he's not been able to do. All his prisoners escape. And he's about to take his own life in despair when suddenly he hears Paul say, "Don't take your life. We have not fled." And this man was so amazed at these people who did not selfishly take advantage of the situation, where they could have escaped and did not, that he wanted to know how they could be that kind of people. And Paul gave him the gift that had been given to Paul on the Damascus Road. "What must I do to be saved?" is what the Philippian jailer says. And he lets him look into the face of God through the lens of Jesus, and to see that smiling countenance instead of that scowling countenance. And so the Philippian jailer is also converted, which means that the three people that constitute the nucleus of this first church come from all social stratas of that society. Lydia was a prosperous, upper-class person. A slave girl who was also looked on as a psychic, probably looked on as demented. A middle-range public official, the Philippian jailer. This church came into existence with Paul giving the gift that had been given to him. To the mystery of godness, Jesus gives a face. And so that's how the little church in Philippi got started. Now, on two subsequent occasions, after he left, he came back and visited this congregation. They turned out to be some of his longest and dearest friends. They were people who from the first had stood by him. They were people that he really did come to trust. He has a very affectionate relationship, as we're going to see as we read the letter. Very, very warm relationships with these people. After he leaves Philippi, he goes to several other places. He goes to Thessalonica. He goes down to Athens. He spends a good bit of time in Corinth. He goes over to Ephesus. And now, when we're getting ready for the time when he writes this particular letter, by this time, he has gone to Jerusalem to take some money that he had gathered from his churches, and the same charge of disturbing the peace gets leveled at him again. Let's face it, Paul was a controversial temperament. He was a man who burned with the blue flame of a fanatic. He had been so fanatical against the Christians, he had persecuted them, and once he became a Christian, he had this same kind of strong personality that evoked all kinds of controversy. So he was in jail many times, always on the charge of disturbing the peace. He was in jail first in Philippi. He was in jail in Corinth for a while. He was in jail in Ephesus. And then when he went over to Jerusalem, once again he's accused, and so he's put in jail in Caesarea. He appeals to the Roman emperor because he doesn't feel like he's been given a fair hearing, and so he is taken to Rome. And the letter that we're going to be working with was written about 10 years after this church had been started. By this time, he is a prisoner over in Rome, and I'll explain a little later that prison back then was not exactly what it is today. He was under house arrest, that would be the best way to put it, awaiting his time to make his appeal to the emperor. And the immediate reason for writing this particular letter is that the folk in Philippi had heard that he was in prison in Rome. And so they sent one of their members, Epaphroditus, with some money to try to help him during his imprisonment. And they sent Epaphroditus along to care for him. Now, Paul was probably living in a house that he rented in Rome. He was under house arrest. He had a guard with him all the time. But it was not the kind of solitary confinement that we sometimes think of as modern prisons. So people could come and go and visit with him. But he was there, and so they sent this member to take care of him. And lo and behold, after he brought news to Paul about what was happening in Philippi, Epaphroditus gets very sick. And so Paul is having to take care of him, though he had been sent to take care of Paul. And he gets well enough to go back. And so Paul writes this letter, which we're going to be studying this fall, for the explicit purpose of thanking the people in Philippi for the money that they had sent by Epaphroditus. He tells them that Epaphroditus is not a coward, as the word had gotten out, that he didn't just get sick because he was scared, but he really had been sick and he was now better. And then the third reason for writing the letter was to let them know how he was doing in this time of imprisonment. So it's a very personal letter. It's a letter that reflects what's going on in Paul's life. Also reflects back on what had happened in the life of the Philippian church. As Fred Craddock says, this is not the kind of letter that would be addressed occupant, Greco-Roman world, whoever you may be. It was addressed to very specific people that Paul knew quite well, and with whom he had had at least a decade of history. I have put on your table the specific text that we're going to be working with tonight. And there are actually 6 paragraphs here. They fall, it seems to me, into 4 categories. The first paragraph is a standard salutation. Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi with the bishops and deacons, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Many of Paul's letters began with this kind of stylized introduction. Grace and peace are the 2 great things that had come to Paul as he had learned to see God through the face of Jesus. And so he always begins by reminding of that. Now, the first 3 paragraphs, I'd like to suggest the way it had been, that there's a backward look to the first paragraph, the way it was, the way he hoped it would be in the future. And in each of these, we get a glimpse, it seems like to me, into St. Paul and into the strong ties that he had with the Christians at Philippi. First of all, he said, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you, making my prayer with joy, thankful for your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And I am sure that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. First thing he says to these people is, I really do remember how you were to me from the very first. And as I remember you, I am filled with gratitude. I am filled with gratitude because I recall how good you were to me. He's thinking now of Lydia. He's thinking now of this demented slave girl. He's thinking of the Philippian jailer and all the other people who had gathered in that little house church. And he really does appreciate the loyalty of these people. Now realize his first arrest took place in Philippi. And that would have been an embarrassment. That would have been a very threatening situation. It would have been easy for these new converts to have distanced themselves from this one who had quickly become controversial. And what he most appreciates as he remembers them was that they had had that kind of loyalty that is at the heart of authentic friendship. They had been willing to stand with him not just when the times were easy, but also when the times were difficult. And if you'll look back over your own life, the people you probably remember with the greatest gratitude are the folk who stuck with you when the going got tough and when it was easy for other people to look the other way and simply be indifferent to you when you were having the worst of your times. Those people that were loyal enough to stay with you, as these folk had stayed with Paul and had continued to stay with him. That's the thing you remember with great gratitude. Many years ago when I was serving in Mississippi, a friend of mine got accused of a white-collar crime. It was one of these complicated deals where supposedly he had signed some wrong things. And so the papers were just filled with the accusations that were being made against him. He was a rather prominent person. And it was very embarrassing to him and his family, and lots of conversation and gossip, of course, was going around about him. And he had a friend in the community who was a quiet but loyal sort. And I'll never forget what that friend chose to do in the midst of this controversy around this rather public person. He filled his pockets with little rocks, little pebbles. And when anybody that he'd meet on the street say, have you heard the story about so-and-so? He would reach in his pocket, pull out a pebble, and say, he that is without sin, let him cast the first stone. He said it was an incredible conversation stopper. That all of a sudden, the people who wanted to talk about the seeming misfortune of this man suddenly were brought back to what Jesus once said, and that is that if we don't have all our stuff worked out, then maybe we'd be better served to do our homework than to always be trying to rock down other people. You've heard me say before that I think Jesus told us not to judge each other because we never know enough. We never know all the circumstances back of certain acts. None of us have lived inside another person's skin. And to be so filled with judgment and condemnation is simply acting beyond what we honestly have the right to do and the evidence to do. I had a Pentecostal preacher friend once who was very, very shrill in his judgments. He really did have a very, very sharp tongue when it came to anybody's imperfection. And he told me that one night he had a dream. And lo and behold, Jesus was standing in front of him. And Jesus said, you are being so harsh in the pulpit these days. And in the dream, my friend said, but Lord, I can't justify what some of the people in my congregation are doing. And Jesus said, who asked you to justify them? That's my job, not yours. He said, I've asked you to forgive. I've asked you to stand with people. I've asked you to wash one another's feet. Why don't you come off the judge's seat, which you have no evidence enough to occupy, and why don't you get a towel and a basin and begin to do for dirty people what I asked you to do? And my friend woke up and said it had changed forever the way he went about his, quote, prophetic ministry. He didn't really know enough. Justifying other people's behavior is God's business, not ours. And the interesting thing is that my well-placed friend proved to be exonerated. The charges against him were eventually dropped. And I heard him say that as he looked back on that whole painful episode that had cost him so much in terms of what other people thought of him, he said, the person I remember with the greatest gratitude was that quiet and loyal friend who chose to take a pocket of pebbles as his way of dealing with a very, very difficult situation. When I would suggest to you that that's something of the way Paul felt about these folk. They had stood with him from the first, and even when the going was worst, the worst for him, they continued to do the best of things. And that leads him to this wonderful statement, I am sure that he who has begun a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. I said last week that they're wonderful preaching texts in the book of Philippians, and here is one of the first and one of the best. What Paul is saying here is that I remember how it all began, and I remember who began it. It was the grace of that God that sent Jesus into our world, and I have every confidence that what was begun back there 10 years ago, because of that persistent grace, is going to continue until it comes to the completion that God had in mind when He started. This is an incredibly wonderful promise that God is not a quitter, that what God has begun in our lives, God is going to have the tenacity and the ingenuity to complete. I had a friend in college who had been in the World War II in the Army. He had seen the carnage of war. And like so many of his generation, he came back. He wanted to be part of the answer, not part of the problem. He decided that he was called into the ministry. He had a heart as big as creation itself, but unfortunately his mind was several sizes smaller than his heart. He was not good at studies. He had a very, very difficult time making his grades, and he got so discouraged. And I remember he used to come back to this verse again and again. He who has begun a good work in you will bring it to completion. And I remember he said, I've got to let whatever it was God had in mind when He started this journey, I've got to be willing to let that unfold itself. There is a great consolation in realizing that God does have a stake. God does have a stake in bringing us to fullness. And you know as well as I do that when you look at things in the middle of a creative process, oftentimes appearances are deceiving. Across the years, I've had the occasion to build 4 houses, starting from scratch and building homes to live in. And I'll be honest with you, in the middle of the process, it looks hopeless. I mean, a building under construction doesn't have much beauty. If you don't understand how builders work, you wonder why they're doing it, why it's taking so long. And it's very easy to get despairing about a process if all you're looking at is the appearance of the middle. I think this particular text suggests to us that we mustn't jump to conclusions about our present condition because something has been begun that has not yet been completed. And we can trust the one who started it to bring what He wanted into completion. And therefore, it's a counsel not to despair when things look so incomplete, when it looks like that nothing is ever going to get finished. My old football coach used to say to us day after day, nothing is more irrelevant to the final outcome of the game than the score at halftime. He was so afraid if we were ahead at halftime, we'd get complacent, or if we were way behind, we'd get despairing. He kept saying nothing is more irrelevant to the ultimate outcome than the score at halftime. And I think that is something of what St. Paul is offering here as a hope. This church had many growth struggles. They had lots of conflicts from without and from within. At times they didn't look much like. They didn't much like a wonderful, wonderful creation of God. But he says, wait a minute. It was God who started this good work. And let's remember that God has the power to see it through. Another way of putting it is that God has a very long attention span. God is not fickle. God doesn't start things thoughtlessly and then lose interest and turn away. Just the other day I had a wonderful thing happen. A friend of mine in Louisville, Kentucky, an older woman, I think she's moving into smaller quarters and is clearing out some old things. And she sent me some pictures of my little girl when she was 3 and 4 and 5 years old that she had taken because our two families were good friends. And I don't have a lot of pictures of Laura Lou from that stage. And seeing those pictures brought back a flood of memories. And one of them is how on Christmas morning, our children, we had a practice in our family of not opening presents until Christmas morning because that just built incredible pressure into the system. The children would be squeezing presents and rattling them and listening to them, but we tried to help them. But if we didn't do it till Christmas morning, that meant way early in the wee hours. They were knocking at the door, is it time, is it time? In fact, we even had some movies where every package has been opened. I mean, all of it. Hours has been put in, and it's still dark outside. I mean, the sun hadn't even come up. But I remember it's amazing that on the very day that there was such anticipation to get to open those presents, so help me, by sundown on Christmas, those same children were saying, we don't have anything to do. You know, what can we play with? Lo and behold, what they had been so intent on getting to, they had a very short attention span when it came to continuing to enjoy it. My point is that God is not like that with what God has begun. There is a persistence in the Holy One that we can rest in. God does not wind us up like toy soldiers and let us run for a while and then forget us in indifference. But what the good work that God has begun, God continues. And so as He remembers these people and He remembers their loyalty, He has this great sense that God is not finished with anything yet, and therein can be our hope. Nothing more irrelevant to the final outcome than the score at halftime. The way it is right now is not by any means the definition of the way it's going to be. The next paragraph focuses in on the way Paul understands his present relationship with the Philippians. It is right that I should feel thus about you all, because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. Remember now that Paul is writing these words from a house arrest in Rome. He did not start the church in Rome, and therefore he did not have old friendships and old ties there. He had longed to go to the capital city to preach the gospel, but he didn't have lots of community there when he went. And therefore, as you read between the lines here, he's in this strange place, and you get real senses of loneliness. That he is coming back in this moment to his memory of the way those friends had been to him. Because truth be told, he didn't have much companionship and much support in the context in which he found himself. Last Monday I got some really sad personal news. I heard over NPR that Father Henry Nouwen, a Dutch Jesuit priest, and an old friend of mine going all the way back to Yale, had died sometime Monday. Many of you have perhaps read some of Henry's books. He came to this country from Holland, studied at Notre Dame, and really stayed in this country for the rest of his career. He was a marvelous pastoral counselor. I first got to know him when I did some lectures at Yale, and our friendship has continued since then. He was 68 years old. The last 2 years he'd been the chaplain at a community that takes care of disabled adults up in Canada. But the last time I talked to Henry, he said to me, you know, there's nothing much lonelier than being an old Catholic priest. He said, when I went into the priesthood, I didn't realize what celibacy was going to ask of me in terms of what resources I would have at the end of my life. And if you've read many of Henry's works, you know that note of loneliness was there. He paid a real price for the way he chose to give himself to the ministry, and St. Paul had done the same thing. Paul says in one of his letters that he chose not to marry because he felt the mission he'd been called to would make it impossible for him to be a faithful husband, that is, to be with somebody all the time. He made the sacrifice just like so many have made it in the service of the gospel. And there's a real loneliness that you hear in this that leads him to say, I yearn for you with all the affection of Christ. That is, he really did find the way they had been to him particularly important, since he didn't have much support and much community where he was. I remember saying last week that Fred Craddock said that letters both denote distance and are also an attempt to bridge distance. Most of the time people don't write letters unless they're physically separated. But then letters are an attempt to bridge that distance. It's the next best thing to being there. And so he writes to these people, and as he's remembering how good they used to be with him, the memories of how they were to him became his resource and his strength for his loneliness. I can't help but feel the poignancy of this old man with lots of disappointments on his plate, mostly by himself, remembering with affection those folks that had loved him. He now turns to some of his hopes for the Philippians in the future. It is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve what is excellent, and may be perfect and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruits of righteousness which come through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. As he remembers these people and as he yearns for them in the present, here's what he hopes is going to happen to those folks. Here is the good work that God had begun that he wants to see come to completion. And what's the shape of it? Well, first of all, that their capacity to love may grow and enlarge. We were put here, I am convinced, as William Blake put it, to learn to bear the beams of love. We were put here to receive the incredible, graceful love of God, and then, having received it, to do like a mirror, to shine that love on to others. I believe when it comes to the final judgment, the one thing that's going to be important is how much capacity of love have we allowed God to develop. How fully loving have we learned to be? If God is love, then how much money you amass, how many trophies you collect, how much success you may have gained in the eyes of other people, all of that is of lesser significance than the simple question, how fully have you developed your God-given capacity to love? Love and truth are the two things we can take with us through the veil that leads into the next life. Everything material is going to be left here. But what we know and what we love, that capacity has an eternal quality to it. So he prays that their capacity to love may grow. He prays that this love which he wants to grow is going to be characterized by wisdom and discernment. Now, love is most certainly something we feel. Love is something about which we can speak. But love is most of all what we do. And therefore, to ask that our love be wise, to ask that instead of just a lot of sentimental feelings, that we really know how to say what happens to you makes a difference to me, and I want my life to bless you. We need to ask that our capacity to love may grow, and part of that capacity is learning how to be wise in our loving. Now, we've all known people who, in the name of love, have done things terribly unwise. Sometimes we forget that the things that are good for us may at first have a bad taste. That sometimes things that are painful may offer more promise of really growing somebody to their full stature than simply giving them what they want when they want it. I remember a little story about a little boy who happened to be present when the miracle of a butterfly coming out of a caterpillar chrysalis actually happened. He watched as the caterpillar's sides began to show all kinds of motion from the inside. And finally the chrysalis broke open, and with great and persistent effort, this new creature, this butterfly, managed to fight its way free from this encrusted beginning place, and at last broke free and was able to fly off into the world as a light and beautiful butterfly. Well, the little boy felt sorry that butterflies had to go through such agony to get born. So he got another caterpillar, put it by his bed, watched it very closely, And lo and behold, in due time, the same birth struggle began to happen in this caterpillar. Thinking he was doing something loving, he ran and got his father's razor and cut the chrysalis open and laid back the sides so that this caterpillar would not have to struggle and not have to go through all this agony to get free. And what he discovered was that that butterfly, because it didn't have to struggle, did not develop strength enough in its wings to be able to fly. It was the pain of getting free from the encasement that had built the strength that enabled the butterfly to become what it was. One of my great fears, and I've said this several times here, is that here in Mountain Brook, we are so intent on keeping our children from suffering, so anxious to smooth the way and not let them have to go through some of the handicaps that maybe we had to go through, that with the best of intentions, we give too much and ask too little, and therefore deprive our children of developing the strength that only comes when you have to struggle. There are children in North Birmingham and West Birmingham that are incredibly self-reliant because they have had to struggle with difficult situations, and I'm not saying that that is a better situation. I simply say that for love to be all that love is, it needs to be wise. And that leads to the next thing that Paul says, is that he wants the love to become wise by learning the art of discrimination. What he calls it is approving the things that are excellent. One of the saddest things to me about our present situation is that the word discrimination has become a bad word. Now, when it's used wrongly, I understand why it's being shameful. But the truth is, the very essence of our humanity is being able to distinguish admiration and distinguish that from the things that have lesser value. When I was ordained to the Baptist ministry back in 1953, my old uncle, who at the time was pastor of Southside Baptist Church, Dr. John McKenna, he preached my ordination sermon, and he used this as his text. And he used it, may you distinguish between the things that differ. And he challenged me to learn how to make distinctions between various realities. And Jesus suggests that we have to do that when he says, don't cast your pearl before swine. That is, have some sense of what is worth what and who can receive what. I had a friend who went to do a teaching in a church, and he came back and said, boy, it did not go well. He said the whole weekend was just an absolute bust. And he said, I'll be honest, my stuff I don't think was very good. I hadn't really prepared it as I did, but he said, bad as it was, it really and truly didn't deserve the kind of hearing that I got. He said, I honestly think I was giving artificial pearls to genuine swine. And that is a rather judgmental statement, but it goes back to being able to distinguish what is worth what. And if we're going to love wisely, we've got to learn how to know what is worth what. And discrimination, when it is the act of discerning what is relative value, is something very, very valuable. He ends by saying to be filled with fruits of righteousness, that is, that you come to be those things that are appropriate, which is what the word righteousness really means. The last two paragraphs of this first letter, of this first chapter of the letter, are very important because what Paul is doing in the last two paragraphs is to give an interpretation to the people in Philippi about what was happening to him. He said, I want you to know, brethren, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So it has become known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brethren have been made confident in the Lord because of my imprisonment, and therefore are much more bold to speak the word of God without fear. I think you need to realize that what had happened to Paul several times in his life had raised some real theological doubts about his enterprise. Now, the conventional wisdom that most people have, unless they've thought about it much, is that if God is present in a situation, there ought not to be any suffering. That there ought to be a correlation between piety and prosperity. And if there is suffering, then it means that God must not be there. Now, what that kind of thinking, which is the basis of where the book of Job begins, that God rewards goodness with prosperity and God punishes bad behavior with all kinds of misfortune, if that is the way that you're looking at it, then for a man who claimed that he was serving God to wind up in jail at the end of his life, to wind up confined to prison, to wind up having to wait for the Roman officials to decide whether he lived or not, that cast real doubts on the religious validity of what he was doing. People were saying, how can Paul be what he claims to be, and the kinds of things that happened to him that have happened? If God were really for him, would not God have rescued him or prevented these things from happening? In other words, Paul had his experience was creating real doubts as to the validity of his mission. And this part of the letter is so important because what it says is that that is a superficial and a very inaccurate reading of the way God works in the world. Let me pause for just a moment and do something that I've done before, and that is give you a very brief statement of my own understanding of God's ways in history and how we are to interpret and understand the things that happen. I've said this before and I want to say it again. In my view, God has power, but God is love. Now what that means is that God possesses all kinds of potency, but in God's heart of heart, God is more than just sheer force like a wind. God is love. Now, if God is love, that means that He creates creatures with the capacity of love, which means that we have to be given some freedom. There is no such thing as love without freedom. If something is coerced, then it cannot be loving. If something is loving, then there's got to be a measure of freedom. And what this means is that God has given each one of us a measure of power, and He has given us the freedom to do with it what we will. If this were not the case, then history would have no meaning whatsoever. Another metaphor is that at one point in the beginning, God had all the cards of creation in His own hands. Everything belonged to God. But so that we could know some of God's kind of joy, to use a gaming image, God began to deal the cards of power around until every creature has some power and every creature has freedom. Now, what this means is that you and I, out of this circle of power that has been given to us by God, we can come out of that circle in any direction if we're truly free. This means that we can do beautiful and wonderful things with our power, or we can do terrible and destructive things. And because God is love, God gives us the freedom to use our power as we will. But the great good news of the gospel is that the one who has dealt us into the game, and now there are many players and not just one player, God has stayed at the table in the game, and whatever we do in our freedom, that is, we come out of the circle of our power, we come into another circle, which I have called God's ingenious mercy. Now what this means is that God can take anything that we choose to do, even if it is utterly destructive in motivation and consequence. God can take anything that we choose to do in our freedom, and in His ingenious mercy, like the old alchemist, He can take one kind of thing and bring something else out of it, which means that we can do things which in intention are meant for evil. And God has ingenious ways of somehow taking that and turning it to good purposes. The whole story of Joseph that we worked with all last spring or several springs ago, all the mistakes that were made by Jacob and Joseph and his brothers, it finally came that the famine had swept over and Joseph had gotten to a place of power, and he's able to save all of Abraham's descendants, and he ends up by saying, you meant it for evil. The things you did were terrible. God used them for good. Now this, I think, is the most mature way to understand why things happen. There are many players in history. Many things happen that God did not originate. God did not intend that power be used this way, but because we are free, God allows this to happen. But God has the power to take even the worst things and has ways of bringing the best out of them. And Paul is saying here, this is exactly what has happened in my imprisonment. He's saying the reason I'm in prison is because lots of people have used their power unjustly. The owners of that slave girl that had him put in prison for the first time, the Jewish opponents who stirred up trouble for him, all of the reasons why he was put into prison go back to this mystery of iniquity, people using their power in ways other than God intended. But if you ask, what can God do with what we in our freedom have done, Paul says the amazing thing is that what has happened that was evil in intent and evil in consequence, God has used this to advance the gospel. God has taken my imprisonment and He's using it as a way of accomplishing His purpose. And he says that three different kinds of people are hearing the gospel because of my imprisonment that would never have heard it had this evil thing not happened. The first group is that he was able to witness to the Praetorian Guard. This was the 10,000 elite soldiers that Caesar had gathered around him to be his bodyguards. He had access to these people because of his imprisonment in ways he would have never have access had this not happened. Now realize he's under house arrest. Every 8 hours as he is there in Rome waiting to see the Caesar, every 8 hours a different Praetorian Guard comes, and there's a 3-foot chain that is linked to Paul and linked to those people. And for every 8 hours there's a change of guard, which meant that for 2 years, every day 3 different elite guards came and sat within 3 feet of Paul, and he had the chance to bond with them in a kind of Christian friendship, to ask them about their lives and what they were doing. He had a chance to show them the face of God through the lens of Jesus. And so over 2 years, if you'll figure it up, at least 2,000 of these elite Roman soldiers had access to hearing the gospel because something that was meant for evil, God found a way to use it for good. And Paul was flexible enough that when he was given this impediment, in one sense, he looked for the way that God could use it. Now, I would like to suggest that this is the way for us to cope with the things that on the surface seem to be so irrational and so evil. To believe that there is nothing, no matter how evil intended or how evil in consequence, that God can't find a way to turn into something good. Paul says, I have gotten to people I would have never gotten to if this hadn't happened. Second thing that happens is that he was able to embolden some of the other Christians by his courageous using of his opportunities for them to step up to the plate and fill in the gap that his imprisonment had created. And then he ends by saying that not everybody that's in the Christian church has responded to me as have the best. Remember the circle of freedom. We can come out of it in any direction. He said some people are glad I'm in prison. Some people are using this occasion as the time for them to try to get ahead themselves. But then Paul says, look, things don't have to be perfect to be good. God can use anything. God can write straight with crooked lines. And therefore he is saying, instead of you're looking on this as God must not be alive because this suffering has happened, look on the fact that God has taken the worst that human beings have been able to conceive, and He can still bring out of it His best. So here is the old dictum, where there is suffering, there can be no God. Paul operated out of the thesis, where there is suffering, there will be the ingenious one. It doesn't mean because God is love that we will never suffer. What it does mean is that God will never abandon us, and that God will find ways in the worst of times to do good things. One of the great sermon events I ever witnessed was a black preacher back in the 60s, Charles Body. When the civil rights struggle was just going with such intensity, I heard him preach one night on that wonderful story from Daniel, the story about the 3 Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who would not bow when they were over in Persia to the pagan. And so the enemies said to the imperial ruler, these men are being disloyal. And he did what he had to do. He said, unless you bow down to this idol, I'm going to have to execute you in the fiery furnace. And they said, we will not bow. He fired the furnace with great, great sadness. He went down and saw these 3 fine young Hebrews thrown into the midst of that incredible heat. He came back a little while later, expecting to see nothing but ashes, and lo and behold, he sees not just the 3 Jews walking around untouched, but he sees a 4th presence in the midst of that furnace. And the great black preacher said, God doesn't save us from the flames. He saves us in the flames. He doesn't keep us from suffering, but he sees that suffering is turned for good. And I believe that that spirit, which enabled him to see in the worst of circumstances, even in that God has the power to advance the gospel. Here again he is saying, the one who has begun a good work, count on it. That one is capable of finishing.